All right, so welcome to, I don't know, this is the fifth or sixth public policy webinar, not webinar, sorry, seminar of the year. I just flew back from Los Angeles and bit jet lag. Today we are very honored to have Dr. Simon Commander to talk about his book published last year at the Cambridge University Press called The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism. I had a brief chat with Dr. Commander and asked him, like, why Asia? So he gave me two reasons. One is Asia is important, no need to explain. Its contribution to global GDP has been rising, so therefore to have a deeper understanding about what's going on in this part of the world is obviously important and needs no explanation. And second, he has a very strong interest on Asian economies after working at the World Bank and also the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London for many, many years. So let me give a very brief introduction about Dr. Commander, and then he's going to take over the stage to talk about his book with some PowerPoint slides. So he's currently Altura Managing Partner, has extensive experience working with both public and private sectors in an advisory capacity. Currently, he's based in Bangkok, Thailand. His focus has mainly been on emerging markets. He worked in senior positions over extended period at the World Bank, Washington, D.C., and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. He was the editor for EBRD, European Bank for Construction and Development, Transition Report from 2002 to 2009. In addition to all this, he has been doing a lot of advisory work for many governments, many countries, many NGOs, many multilateral organizations. He holds an undergraduate degree from Oxford and a doctoral degree from Cambridge University. He has been a faculty member of Cambridge University and London Business School. We are so glad to have him here in Hong Kong. He hasn't been to Hong Kong for many years, obviously. He just arrived last night, and tomorrow he's going to give another talk at Hong Kong Forum. And I have the responsibility to make sure that he feels welcome and at the same time get to try our best Chinese restaurants in time. Without further ado, thank you, Dr. Commander.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Hewitt, for the introduction, which is particularly appreciated as I know you've just arrived from Los Angeles, and I know if I'd been doing that journey, I would have gone to bed. So it's very nice that you've come here, and very nice that everyone else has come. So one of the reasons I'm here is, in a sense, to promote our book, The Connections World, which I mentioned, which I wrote with my old friend and colleague from LSE, Professor Saul Estrin. And the book, if anyone is subsequently interested, I think there's some brochures outside where Cambridge offers a sizable discount. But honestly, sadly speaking, I find that Amazon is far more efficient, because by the time you pay for the postage, the price from Amazon is the same, and they get it to you in a few days. But anyhow, there it is, and let me now talk about it. The book really is a product of many years, as I mentioned, of trying to merge two streams of life and career. One is academia, and one is public policy. And the book was written with the intention of trying to make an economic analysis of Asia, and a particular feature of Asia, which we summarize in the title, The Connections World, accessible to a reasonably wide audience. And because of the nature of the topic, some of the analysis strays way beyond the normal boundaries of economics into political economy, because clearly a central character in our analysis, or central set of characters in our analysis, are the connections that run between politics, politicians, and business. So without further ado, let me start, and first of all by saying how delighted I am to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and feel free to criticize and comment, even if I've got a thick skin, so I welcome good comment. Okay, look, as Hewitt mentioned, the reason the book focuses on Asia is A, it's extremely interesting, B, it's extremely important, and see the future of Asia is going to be of immense weight, not just in simple metrics like the GDP, or even indeed the incidence of poverty and other indicators, but for the world and in a broader sense, geopolitically as well as otherwise. Now, I should say at the outset that the book really isn't about the whole of Asia. Obviously, Asia is a very heterogeneous place, but the book really focuses on what is rather simplistically referred to sometimes as middle-income Asia. It includes the big countries, China and India, Southeast Asia, and the rest of South Asia, but it doesn't include Laos, Cambodia, Bhutan, Nepal, and so on. Now, our starting point is that the great success that Asia has been, after all, it is the great success of recent times in all respects, had been achieved through the deployment of policies and business configurations that are, in many respects, very different from those that exist in the advanced economies, and even, we would argue, in the advanced economies when they were on their rise. We can come back to that a bit later. And the central features that are different are the deployment of what is sometimes referred to as activist industrial policy, notably of a vertical nature, in other words, picking particular sectors and activities and supporting them. South Korea is probably the case most in hand. But we argue, actually, that this is, if not a minority taste, after all, most Asian economies have pursued industrial policy in one form or the other, most of them not very successfully, unlike South Korea. What has actually been pursued, and much more importantly, is something far more tacit, which is the combination of public interests with those of large businesses, and in particular of business groups. And I'll come to what business groups are. And that means, we argue in the book, that the old debate that has clunkered on for many decades about market versus state is, apart from being rather tired, actually misses the mark. In point of fact, in Asia, this sort of coordination, which is meant to be one of the great byproducts of activist industrial policy, arises through other mechanisms as well, and with similarly powerful and, by and large, quite beneficial results. But the book argues that those beneficial results, which have played out over the last 50 years, are far less likely to play out over the next 50. Now, the common feature across all of these rather different economies is that there are very pervasive and highly persistent ties between politics, politicians, and businesses, and in particular business groups. And this is what we run up in the term the connections world. This is what we call it. Now, let's go to what the connections world is composed of. Well, at its apex sit political parties, individual politicians, and on the other hand, businesses, and in particular these business groups. Their interactions are immensely transactional. They sometimes have reciprocity in play, as we've seen, for instance, in COVID and the role of private businesses, but they're immensely transactional. So politicians look, depending on the political system, for campaign contributions, jobs for them, their family, board positions, jobs for their constituents, and so on and so on. Things that are not unique to Asia by any means. I recognize that as being completely au courant in the US or indeed in the UK for that matter. Now, firms or businesses look for protection, as they often do. It can be from foreign or domestic competition, and we can think of many examples quite easily. They look for subsidies, loans, often from state-owned banks, which are susceptible to political control, public sector contracts, a massive part of the game, and permits and licenses. Now, on this book tour, I've just been in India. The reality in a country like India is that if you want to operate across most sectors of interest, you need a permit or license still. It's not just about trade liberalization and low tariffs. It's all about other things as well. And who do you need a permit or license from? Well, you obviously need it from government and from politicians and political parties. And this all really matters. Now, we argue that this plays out not so much in stories of bilateral cronyism. That's been well documented, for instance, in the context of China. Min Junpei's book on China's crony capitalism was a very interesting read. But we argue that it's mainly about networks of relationships and that go way beyond bilateral transactions. And these networks bind together with common and self-interested purpose and have very similar ways of operating that cut across political systems and economies at different levels of development and with different resource endowments as well. So, for example, we can say China and Vietnam, unique political parties. You would therefore expect, in the context of a network analysis, that most of the links and ties would run through the central and unique political party, and therefore there would be a great deal of centrality in the relationship. However, you could also find, and we were just discussing a bit earlier in Ho's office, that other economies which don't have unique parties may have highly intense degrees of connections. And what do I mean by that? They may have relatively few players, few businesses or business groups, and most of the ties will tend to run through them and the respective political entities. The final point I want to make at this point, and then I'll go to some network maps, is most of the ties that exist are not, as it would have been the case 40, 50 years ago, from politicians to state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises, with some exceptions, are a waning taste and number. But what is so interesting is that most of these networks connect politics with private sector players and individuals. Now take a look at these two maps. It takes a bit of time to load. This is from a data set that we use in the book, a proprietary data set of politically connected individuals and entities. And it's actually got a hell of a lot going on in it. They're basically here about 175 to 150,000 nodes or observations. So the links that lie between them, they may be links, for instance, of politicians sitting on boards or companies receiving public contracts and so on, are very, very hard to see. But there's no prize for guessing which is China and which is India. Let's start with India. Two major parties, a bunch of regional parties, some state-owned enterprises, declining in importance, I should say, lots of individuals, and lots of the light green private companies as well that figure. In China, of course, the party sits at the center, radiating out to the functionaries, lots of state-owned enterprises, because there are many still, and they're, of course, the most politicized elements of the firm sector, but also lots of private individuals and private firms and businesses. And in the book, we have network maps for every country in Asia that we cover in this. Now, in the private world there, the private firms, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're not just talking about standalone businesses in the sense that, say, someone from the UK or Spain might think of them. We are mostly talking about business groups. And business groups are not the same as advanced economy conglomerates for the most part. There are some family business groups in Western Europe, we can come back to that, and elsewhere, but much fewer in number and much fewer in weight in the economies. Business groups in Asia, as is widely known from a long literature of really excellent work, are largely family, often dynastic. Again, using Indian examples, think of Tatas or Birlas or many of the big business groups. They'll now be in their third, fourth generation or more. They are enormously diversified. They tend to do a hell of a lot of things. And that is weird because, in one sense, because if you look at, for instance, the literature on diversity or in advanced economy, there's actually a penalty, at least in the stock market, for doing too many things, as it were. And in fact, even in emerging market literature, there appears to be some sort of penalty. But this is not reflected in how they look. They are very, very diversified. And again, I don't want to stick too much with India, but it's such a vibrant example. Many of you will have seen the recent ruckus about Adani, the Adani Group, prompted by a short sellers report. By the way, not a very good report, but enough to do an awful lot of damage. Now, Adani is a perfect example of a nascent business group. It's a first-generation family business group that has grown essentially through political connections, and rapidly. Between 2000 and 2020, thereabouts, those dates, the market cap of its listed entities, of which that's only a fraction of the total, rose by over 4,000%. I don't see many companies or entities doing that. The short sellers report, by the way, has crushed that. They've declined subsequently by over 60%, but we'll come back to that perhaps in the discussion. Now, Adani is not just into ports and airports and other infrastructure, strongly promoted by government, but is into mining, fossil fuels, and now, in a huge way, renewables. So the portfolio is absolutely massive. The corporate governance is completely opaque. An awful lot of stuff is sheltered offshore, mainly in Mauritius, as in this instance, and the control is largely exercised by Adani himself, or if not, by family members, his proxies, who head up components of the group. There's a very weak layer of professional management. Okay? So those are some of the features. Now, why? Well, pyramid-like structures, which are the normal feature of these groups, obviously, and you will know this probably better than I do, allow owners levels of control far in excess of their actual levels of ownership. And that naturally disadvantages minority shareholders and outside investors, and it allows them to tunnel resources around the group and outside of the group if necessary, at will normally. And finally, we argue that these complex structures are tremendously good at deterring predators. And what do we mean by predators? Well, we may mean politicians, new governments who may not like them, who want to nationalize them or sort of, act in an adverse way for them. It's very hard to when everything is so complex and non-transparent. And of course, it deters other businesses from trying to take them over. So you have very low mergers and acquisitions in this world. Now, one of the reasons for why business groups exist, the arguments go back to Ronald Coase and the like, and many others working in this, is of course for missing or incomplete markets. And there's a lot of sense in those arguments. The problem is that if we look at Asia, I think you'd have to close your eyes to argue that the extent of missing or incomplete markets is more than it was 50 years ago. Far from it. Capital markets are much thicker, much more fluid, and managerial and other skill markets much more developed. And yet, over that period of time, not only have you not seen business groups declining, as you might expect from this conjecture, but you've actually seen them increasing in their weight in the economies. And we argue that essentially this is to do with the fact that business groups are endogenous and highly effective in the world of connections. And that's the prime, perhaps, reason for why they persist and flourish as an organizational format. And politicians like it. They can, after all, in the Philippines, as we were discussing earlier, if you wanted to discuss economic policy or actions, you probably could get on the phone to about 6 heads of business groups, and you'd be covering most of the economy. That's not true in other countries, but that's one of the more concentrated cases. But it makes life a lot easier, and as the whole Adani BJP link up shows, you can sometimes argue that business groups can be instruments of national or developmental goals. And in a more positive format, I think the Koreans and Samsung would have probably argued that at various times, and may even argue that to this day. Now, look, the consequences, which I must only just touch on before moving on, is that these groups are highly persistent. Even when regimes change, they don't go away, and they rarely get penalized. So in Suharto's Indonesia, you remember Suharto came to a sticky political end, but all the main business groups in Indonesia, not all, but the vast majority, owe their origins and their growth to the Suharto period. And they're the very same people and groups that exist to this day and dominate the economy. Even the one that was most egregiously tied to Suharto, the Salim group, lost one of its assets, only one, and is still a very, very big player in the domestic economy and internationally. Not only do they stick around, but they concentrate enormous wealth. In South Korea, Samsung now accounts for over 22% of GDP. Pretty incredible. The son of the founder, who died a couple of years ago, left an estate of 21 billion. In Bangkok, in Thailand, where I've just come from, the Kiaravanont family, the CP group, which is extremely powerful, has a combined wealth in excess of about 24, 25 billion. Okay? So these are tremendous engines for accumulation and appropriation. Now, we argue that all of this has clearly not been bad for Asia. You'd have to be looking, if you take growth, poverty, and most other metrics, maybe not distributional metrics. I notice you have Bernie Young coming to talk about those. But if you take the other metrics, then clearly this can be bad for Asia. But we argue in the book that there are three main things that are going to warrant looking very closely at and changing if we're going to go forward. Firstly, competition. Secondly, dualism in the labor market, persisting dualism. And thirdly, the whole challenge of shifting these economies to being based more on innovation than on extensive growth. Remember, much of Asian growth has been greater applications of capital and labor. That's running out of steam, certainly in China, Malaysia, and the richer economies. And although there's scope for more extensive growth in South Asia and the like, even those margins are shrinking quite significantly. Okay, let's go straight to competition. We basically argue that the business groups essentially crowd out competition, and that this can be measured in a variety of ways. Normally when we talk about competition, we want to talk about concentration, we want to talk about profitability, profits, and we want to talk about consumer prices. Now, in the context of the book, it's really almost impossible to talk about profits for the business groups because the accounting is so opaque. So we stick, for the most part, with a discussion of concentration. So look at these numbers, which are really very striking. Now, we have a comparator, the US, which is admittedly a massive economy, so in a sense it sort of slightly downplays it. But what this basically shows on the left and on the right is the top 5 there, the top 10 companies, their revenues, the sum of their revenues relative to national income and GDP. By the way, anyone who wants these slides afterwards, you're welcome to have them, so you don't need to take photos, that you can have the whole pack. And I'd welcome comments, of course. Okay, now, so the US essentially has 3% and about 4%. Okay, that's rather low. Some sectors, of course, like tech, you'll see tremendous amounts of concentration, and that's considered the main challenge in terms of competition policy, but at the level of the economy as a whole. But look at Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam, the top 5 are in excess of 35%, rising to 45% for the top 10. And those are 4 or 5 major business groups, enormously well connected to the political leadership and who have grown at a helter-skelter pace. Thailand, South Korea, similarly, Philippines too. But perhaps the most interesting point are the 2 massive countries, China and India, which are roughly between 12 and 15%. So that's very high. And in some additional work we're doing now, and which in due course I'll post a paper on India, where we're doing a much more detailed look at not only concentration, but consumer prices, the effect on consumer prices, and to some extent of profits, you find an enormous increase. Just to give a slightly different number, the top 15 non-financial, no banks, non-public sector, private in other words, entities, firms in India, now their revenues account for nearly 19% of GDP. If you roll, that was in 2020, if you roll back the clock about 15 years to 2005, that share was about 11 to 12. So tremendously trended, okay? So this is something that is very powerful that's going on, and something that we should really begin to take very seriously, the attenuation of competition. Employment, I'm going to go over it very quickly. Look, Asia has been tremendously successful in creating jobs. The problem is most of the jobs aren't very good jobs. They're low productivity, precarious jobs in the informal economy, and that's as true for China as it is for other countries. Very large informality. So dualism, the old Arthur Lewis conundrum, is still there in a big way. China really hasn't addressed it. And we argue that it really hasn't begun to address it because the formal sector, so dominated by the business groups, really hasn't expanded. So the firm size distribution is like a pyramid. And at the top, a small number of large firms, really good firms. If you have a job in those, they're mainly owned by business groups. You're paid well, you're productive, everything, great. The problem is not that many. A middle section, which is quite small, and very few actually grow into being larger firms. You don't have those sort of natural dynamics. And then a great big massive clunk of firms down in the bottom of the pyramid, most of which are really very poorly performing, okay? So dualism is chronic. And this is going to be a big issue because, you know, it's less so many countries are only reaching replacement rate or below, but some countries, mainly in the subcontinent, in South Asia, still have aggregate labor force growth rates north of 1%. And when you're acting on a labor force that large, that's a lot of people coming into the labor force every year, okay? Now, let me come to innovation, and then I'll move to conclude. Innovation is going to be key. And actually, you know, when we look at theory, there's no reason why you can't have a lot of innovation, even with lots of market power. In fact, some of the most, you know, the sort of standard now models of competition in a monopolistic framework of Philippe Aghion and the like, show that what happens is you may have few players, but they compete very hard, go neck and neck to innovate and get a leg up over their opposition, as it were. So in principle, you could have that. It could also, in principle, have the many benefits from the Adanis of this world getting a lot of preferential resources from banks or government due to their connections. But you can also have other factors that are more ambiguous or indeed actually even negative, like the promotion of rent seeking and the like. So what we argue, again in the book and in some complementary papers which we just published, is that the business groups by and large are relatively innovative. They innovate more than non-business groups, but that's no surprise. They've got more resources, they've got better skills, they've got better connections all round. And they do innovate. They don't innovate as much as one might expect, at least as measured in aggregate, but they innovate much more than non-business groups. But it's rather like a sort of large tree under which not a great deal else grows. They sort of tend to crowd out, or the shade keeps out others from entering. And this is, I think, comes up in a couple of aggregate indexes which look at, you know, innovation scores. I'm, by the way, quite a bit skeptical of these indices, but, you know, for want of other things, one's using them, but also with regard to the relationship between R&D and the quality of patents. And what we argue is that even with the business groups being relatively innovative, Asian economies as a whole do not really stand out as being tremendously innovative places yet. Even though clearly there are lots of very, you know, there are unicorns, quite a few in some of these countries, China, India, even in Indonesia, there's certainly a huge hunger and appetite and entrepreneurialism in the population. But so far, it hasn't burst through, and we argue that part of it is to do with the constraints that come from the existing political and business environment. The place that stands out, of course, is South Korea, which lies way above the line. The line is given by the log of GDP per capita along the horizontal, and R&D to GDP along the vertical. And as you can see, most countries lie along the line, a couple of Philippines and Indonesia way below. But the only one that really stands out is South Korea. And that is also true when you look at the relationship, the efficiency of R&D as the measure of innovation, and the number of patents. Again, South Korea is extraordinarily impressive. Most of the rest sit above the line, given their levels of GDP. So in short, business groups may be relatively innovative, but the economies as a whole are not particularly so, and that's important. Now, we argue in the book that why that is the case has a lot to do with the business configuration and the relationships that link to it and underpin it. And this needs to change, and it will be helpful and positive for society and the economy as a whole if it did change. Will it change? And the argument here is actually not particularly positive or particularly optimistic, shall we say, because quite frankly, everyone in the connections world, who really matter, have few incentives for changing. Yeah, they really don't. And other historical episodes of change go back to the 1930s in the US with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's basic outlawing of business groups. That happened in the aftermath of the Great Depression when there was a political support for radical action. Similarly, in 1945 in Japan, MacArthur did pretty much the same, but that was after the defeat and the view that the kairetsu, as they were so closely integrated to the military state. So those were very exceptional circumstances, and those sorts of circumstances certainly, for good or bad, for good largely, don't exist in Asia. So there's actually nothing that is organically pushing this system to change itself. The benefits of entrenchment are massive, and therefore it's going to take sorts of changes to do that. Now, recently, I go back to the Adani case. A former colleague of mine and ex-deputy head of the Reserve Bank of India came out with the idea that he didn't like Adani. He said this was a symptom of sort of oligarchic capitalism. What should be done? Break it up. Now, this is the sort of reaction that commonly happens when you have market power, but it begs more questions than it answers. How do you break it up? Is it feasible to break it up? What will ensure that breaking it up is actually a lasting policy? And my view is that this is actually slightly lazy thinking, if you can call it, and largely infeasible thinking. So talking about breakups and things ain't going to happen unless there is enormous pressure from below, from civil society and the like. I can come back to it. So there are changes. These are mostly marginal. I'm going to skip over them quite quickly because of time. Corporate governance codes can be changed and improved to give particularly minority shareholders. These are marginal things. Prohibitions, by the way, prohibitions on cross-holding, financial, non-financial bundling. These have all been tried, by the way, in South Korea, and they didn't really work. Israel has been a bit more successful with it, but by and large, the experience is not that promising. What is more promising, however, is taxation. And it's actually quite a surprising one. And it started really in Japan, because although MacArthur outlawed business groups back in 1947, 45, 47, in 1997, the Japanese parliament legalized them again. But they actually haven't made a recrudescence. Why? Well, maybe 50 years is a long time. But secondly, because, of course, in that interim, a 50% inheritance tax, or 40%, I think, in Japan, had been introduced. And inheritance taxes are very penalizing of these large empires. I gave the example of the son of Samsung's founder having a 10 billion inheritance tax bill passed on to his heirs. Similarly, Hanjin Group, another chaebol, the owner of Korean Air, amongst other things, their founder died. I think they have 150 million, and so on and so on. And this is leading, for the first time, despite all the early attempts at prohibitions, to the leadership of these groups rethinking the family basis of it. So my view is taxes conditioned on the business group format, as well as inheritance or successor taxes, are the ways in which to go. Competition policy. We gave this a presentation of this at the Asian Development Bank, and they just had a big meeting with competition policy officials and heads of those agencies recently, and they said there was an appetite to do more, training could be improved, all of those things. But the long and the short of it was there wasn't the political support for those agencies to have much bite, and that was widely recognized. So even if they had better quality staff, better quality technique, but we argue in the book that it's not just about that, it's also what you target. Because competition policy, rightly, is largely concerned with market power in particular segments, in particular markets or activities, say Google in search. Not that the US are actually doing anything about it, but maybe the European Commission is trying to do something about it. But you know, that's a good example of where traditional competition policy lies. But we argue that maybe competition policy needs to add one more arrow to its quiver, and that is to look at aggregate concentration as well, and to condition policy on that too. And if that were the case, then it would begin to address some of the business grouping. And finally, as Hewe mentioned, I worked at the World Bank for a long time. All of this stuff is like, you know, bristle to the mill, really. I mean, they've been generating propositions as to how this can all be better done for ages. And there's actually lots of good practice out. But none of it is being done because the politicians don't want to do it. For instance, asset and interest declarations. It was almost comic. In Pakistan, they're meant to. But when actually we looked, not a single Pakistani MP had lodged an asset or an income declaration, despite it being supposedly a legal requirement. So we know what's got to be done, but honestly speaking, I don't expect a great deal of action on that. And to the extent that there will be action, it will come ultimately, I think, from a factor and a feature that is not really discussed in our book. Maybe it's a big mistake, but certainly it would have required intellectual and analytical skills that are probably beyond us, which of course is pressure from civil society. But even in that, when you have a highly active civil society, like in India, lots of NGOs, lots of papers, lots of journalism working in this area, and lots of stuff getting into the public domain about politicians' behavior, it still doesn't seem to have an awful lot of effect. Now, I don't want to end on a totally dismal note, but I do want to suggest that two things. One, Asia would do well, or the components of Asia would do well to make this an important policy issue. The amount of market power and the amount and the nature of that market power and the way it's accumulated, entrenched and perpetuated is going to be counterproductive for the societies and economies as a whole looking forward. And secondly, I have to say, to make that happen, it's going to require a combination of what in effect are sort of marginal, gradual changes along with pressures from civil society. So I hope I've covered what's in the book. I hope it's going to be of some interest, and thank you very much for listening to me and for your attention.
If you don't mind to stay here
Yes,
to entertain the audience by answering a few questions.
Sure.
But as the moderator, I always abuse my power to ask the first two. Truly insightful sharing, by the way. I know it's not easy to talk about a book in 20 minutes. But I have so many questions in my mind already, and I try to summarize it in a way so that I'm not taking up too much of the time from the audience. And that is, you know, when we think about sort of market power and the degree of competition in an economy, a lot of the time is at the end of the day related to, you know, what you mentioned, but more generally speaking, you know, the level of institutions, like how good the institutions are. So you worked at the World Bank in the 90s. I remember there was a time when I started reading a lot of the papers coming out from the World Bank. You know, my good friend, co-author David Dollar has contributed a lot, and there are also people like Andrei Shaliver and Vishny and etc. And they would run a bunch of regressions looking at, you know, how good institutions will lead to higher growth, more inclusive growth, more check and balances, and as you mentioned, better development in the financial market. So 30 years from the beginning of that literature and all the good work done by you and your colleague at the World Bank trying to measure the institutional quality across countries, what did we learn in the last 30 years? Why some countries still have very, using Asimov's terms, extractive institutions, which lead to some of the phenomena that you discovered in Asia. How would you suggest a government or a political system to transform from sort of more extractive institutional environment to a more inclusive environment so that competition can increase, innovation can increase, and you can calm these business groups, many of them rich families, not to oppose those changes? I guess I asked many questions, but this is really bothering me up to now.
Well, those are great questions and actually pretty difficult ones. Yes, I was at the time at the World Bank, and I remember all of that literature and the discussions we had. As it happened, I was working a lot on Russia, and newly independent Russia, for what it's worth. And a lot of those ideas actually did spill into policy there, and I think ultimately in a disastrous way. And I think the reason that they did was that they were terribly naive, because A, they didn't have a sense of how entrenched opposition could be and the powers of organization of existing players. So in the Russia context, when the privatization that Schleifer and others promoted very actively went ahead, it was a mass privatization and the like. Well, basically, incumbent managers and or others with resources were able to essentially capture the game, really. And what it did in the end was it led to a complete disqualification of privatization and the private sector's force for good in that economy. So I think, sad to say, one of the sources of Putin's power probably comes from exactly this discontentment. It was considered, in effect, a sort of a large order rip-off of assets. That's now, but the general point, but part of the reason why it was designed that way was it just looked as simple, quickly and relatively efficiency. You gave all of you some vouchers, you could trade them and the like, and in principle it looked nice on paper. In reality, it ran out against too many local constraints and proved to be neither clever nor effective, and in fact highly counterproductive. I suppose what we're arguing in the book, anyway, is that the institutional atrophy or inability to develop is endogenous to this system. It's not, another bit of that literature was summarized in the whole idea of the middle income trap. Countries came up, got to a certain level, and then got stuck. But they never really explained why it was a trap. I mean, why couldn't you just keep on cycling, get out of it? Well, the argument, I think, is that, of course, you can get notionally supportive, inverted commas, good, or in Asimoglu and Robinson's term, inclusive institutions, but their effectiveness, as in the example of competition policy, can be almost zero, because, of course, the system is captured or manipulated by. Now, how can you break it? Well, as I said, I don't think radical options are going to be on the table anytime soon. They may come, but if they do come, it will be after a period of lots of disruption and probably highly costly. Whether that's good or bad, that's for all of us to decide. What I think is much more feasible are strategies based on co-option and co-optation. And one method of doing it is, I think, to encourage, two things. To encourage business groups to function as more conventional businesses, and that's hence the emphasis we have. And I think that is potentially feasible. And you can bring in others to do that. And some of the business groups themselves may be susceptible to that if you give them some sorts of incentives to do it. And the second is to, rather than the Indian way, as it were, with Adani and the like, get a couple of preferred business groups and give them even more resources than the others, is make them fight more amongst themselves, compete. And they don't mind doing that. They're very competitive. I mean, it's not a world of they're just sort of, I fish in this pond, you fish in that pond. They all want to fish in the same pond. They all want to go at each other. But, of course, when I say they, that number is circumscribed. So maybe policies that let in new businesses and even incentivize them could be a way to break this logjam.
Very good. Let me ask the second question really quickly. So you show us that the U.S. has probably a much more competitive system, with lower concentration of profits or market shares among the top 5 or 10 companies. But on the other hand, I just came back from the U.S. and I can share with you my reading in the past and also my feelings based on my recent trip is people are worried about exactly what you mentioned about Asia.
Yeah.
Should we say that the U.S. still has the right set of rules and institutions to ensure that they remain competitive and innovative? Or perhaps there's another country, let me not mention any name, in this part of the world that may be doing some of the things that you are suggesting?
Yes. Well, on the US, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, in a way, the aggregate concentration for US is, I mean, it was just for illustration. It's a bit misleading because we know that in certain key sectors in the US, there's a hell of a lot of market power and concentration. And we also know that regulators and competition agencies are largely asleep on the job. And the best chronicling of this, I'm sure many of you have read it, is Thomas Philippon's book, which looks at the US and compares it with Europe. And that's a very nice and profound bit of work empirically and analytically. And it shows that, essentially the US is losing its way in competitive policy. So there's no doubt about that. What I did not want to do in the book, neither saw nor I wanted to do, was to say these problems are just egregiously Asian, because they do exist in other places. It's just that the scale at which they exist and the sort of territorial space that is occupied and the economic space is much greater in Asia. In fact, just to give you a sort of half joke, as it were, when we were presenting in France, at Sciences Po CD, one of the discussants said, "Oh, I've read your book and it reminds me a lot of my own country, i.e. France." And of course, actually, a huge state sector, a small, Macron from École Nationale d'Administration, a whole bunch of, highly concentrated. And that really threw me back because, again, when I was working in the World Bank on Russia, I had some wonderful Russian colleagues, and one of them, in a very thick Russian accent, said to me one day, I love France. It so reminds me of the Soviet Union." So I don't want to say for any that this is unique to Asia, but there are features, both in the incidence and the intensity, that are very specific here. One last point. On Latin America, which is another area where business groups, family business groups, have been important. A, they've been declining over time. And B, I think, and this is where probably some of my naivety as a political scientist would show up, it may be that Latin America signals some of the potentially not very good consequences of doing nothing about it. If you look back, a friend of mine has been recently educating me on this, a historian of Latin America, between 1940s and 70s, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, these sorts of places, essentially they had a very sort of similar model. Big state, directive state, working with big business, mostly these family-owned business groups. In the 70s, that model came unstuck. And what replaced it was, in a sense, a reaction to the entrenchment and the concentration that existed, and it was basically populism in various forms or the other. And that has been, I think, we can all safely say, disastrous. I mean, Latin America's shares of the world economy have gone down. Argentina just continues its endless slide down the slope. But what I think I'm trying to get at is that if there is not a political way found through this sort of thicket, then politicians and others will take routes and paths that may be potentially undermining of this, but in very inefficient and potentially disastrous ways. And one last point, I tried to raise this just in Bangkok in the seminars, but people said, well, we better have that discussion in private. I think you can almost see some of that in the whole Shinawatra experience when Thaksin was, by the way, an extremely good example of a product of the connections world. But when he came to power, he proposed a number of sort of Latin American-ish populist policies. So I just put that down as a potential risk, shall we say.
Let us take a few questions from the audience. We have like 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, first of all, many thanks for these extremely interesting insights. As you rightly pointed out, and also pointed out by the convener, that it's not entirely an Asian problem, it's a question of extent. So my question is that in your book, some of the graphs you highlighted with the red section denoting what's happening in the United States, a very, very tiny part.
Yes.
So my question is that did you try to measure the extent of all these business connections and what is commonly known as the military, industrial, financial complex, characterized by companies like the Koch brothers,
yes,
and the tentacles, and very powerful firms in Wall Street, and companies beholden to these firms. Do you take these kind of connections into account in coming up with the data in your book? So the first one. The second is question is more interesting. You highlighted a very special example of South Korea.
yes.
And it's right up on the chart.
Correct.
Apparently very, very successful in spite
Yes.
of all these clonism and all that.
Sure.
So what's the magic?
Okay. Well, two really, really good questions. Thank you very much. Let me start with South Korea. You're absolutely right. I mean, South Korea is a stunning success, no doubt about it. Having said that, I mean, if you go and talk to South Korean policymakers and the like, their conundrum is not that Samsung and LG and the others that make up so much of the economy aren't highly efficient, highly competitive companies. They don't no one disputes that at all. Because Korea, as I said at the outset, the reason why their industrial policy was so successful was that all of those companies were open to international competition from day one. Now, they received other benefits. I mean, Samsung to this day, by the way, is still receiving subsidies from the government of a non-trivial magnitude. But they basically have to compete in international markets. So they are greatly successful. Now, the South Korean problem is not that. It's that not much else comes up. So if you look at innovation, which is an area that the Koreans are putting a lot of emphasis on doing, you do have some small, sometimes venture-funded companies, but most of them, certainly if they show any promise, tend to get acquired by Samsung and others, and there's very little independent source of it. So the degree of concentration of activity and innovation is very pronounced. And that hasn't been a barrier on growth, not at all of it. But it is a concentration of risk. And that is something I think that the Koreans are very mindful of and very keen to diversify that risk. And I think they're right to. On the US, you're absolutely right. It is a little bit misleading just using it that. I just wanted to give a sort of slight reference point for the Asian numbers. We don't in the book look at the US. There are lots of very good papers, and it is very clear that the connections world is alive and thriving in the US in ways that are sometimes legal, sometimes illegal, and often quite undesirable. So although we don't spend time talking about that, I don't deny for one moment that much of what we have there, or a lot of what we have there, might be seen. There's one difference, of course, at another end. which is that, yes, you mentioned rightly the cock or the coke or whatever, however they pronounce it, these families who give large amounts of money. But the businesses are largely not run as family-owned business groups. So there's a slight disconnect. They normally hive off these trusts or these foundations and then sort of, you know, shell out money to their preferred political clients or whatever.
Thank you. Maybe lady first.
Thank you very much for the talk. And several of the slides I do agree quite intensely because of what we do on the professional world. And if I could just ask you a question, because I understand you have been talking to a lot of counterparts or different parties globally through your connection from the World Bank. Apology, I have not read your book yet, but I'm curious if in your book you have highlighted the last 2-3 decades of some success stories of more innovations, of more transformation or reform of economies, i.e. Japan post-Abe economics, also Taiwan post-privatization,
Sure.
and China in the last 2-3 decades of more of success of reform. If we can plug the country's market cap versus the implications or consequences from the policy and show that correlation to the people that you speak to, do you think it would be helpful for even the business groups to understand if we are more open-minded in terms of embracing some of policies, more corporate governance, transparency, your market cap may have double, et cetera, et cetera? Especially in current very complex world between East, West, would it make sense to people to understand, hey, if we have more coalition within our region, that 1 + 1 might be equal 5?
Yes.
If my question.
No, of course. Well, that's a very good question too. I don't know that I have that good an answer to it. I mean, my feeling from discussions with the heads of some of these business groups and looking at the way they behave, and as I mentioned, I think in the presentation, I mean, a priori, they would stand to gain by having a different organizational format. Their listed components would probably rise in value because investors would. But that's a very complex issue because quite often the equity markets in which they operate have restrictions on foreign investors. They have issues to do with liquidity of those markets. And so the premium that they might get from reorganizing might be smaller than imagined. But I don't actually believe that's the main barrier. I think the main barrier is that almost all these business groups specialize in having multiple forms of ownership. They have the public listed stuff, often in ways that make it very hard for minorities or shareholders or foreign investors to have exercise some stake. And then they have these large private entities that revolve around them, about which there's almost no transparency. Some are now offshore. So I think they would be very reluctant to change that. And I don't really see much evidence of them being willing to do that. One good example which is worth watching is probably the largest family business group in India and the one that's performed the best over time, which is Tata's. Now, Tata's is owned by a family trust, Tata Sons. And the problem for Tata's, at least in terms of the dynamics of family, is that Ratan Tata, the head of the family now, is in his 80s, and he has no children, and there are no heirs. They're Parsis, so people can't marry in, and so they're basically a dying community. So it'll be very interesting to see whether Tata's unravels this weird ultimate ownership structure and goes to a more conventional format. But so far, no signs. So I think the returns to sticking with these structures are still too large. and people don't want to go that way. It's going to take, going back to my response to Weiwei, I think it's going to take much larger carrots combined with sticks, to use an English metaphor, to make them go that way. And that's where clever design will have to come in.
Hi, my name is Louis. I have been working for investment management for 10 years. I'm from Hong Kong, so my questions particularly started with some example about big conglomeration that actually work well between both sides. Like Starbucks China, they buy back all those shares from 216. And also McDonald's, I'm going to meet the McDonald's CFO tonight. They're actually run by citing, the China SOE, starting from before COVID. So if they actually consolidated their profit and loss on the listed market, would you consider that as an American company, or you pretty much put it in two companies? Because McDonald's China, Greater China, to me actually is a Chinese company, because the P&L. And for Starbucks, except Taiwan, because Taiwan do a trade. So Presidential Group, which is a Taiwan family, own Starbucks for internally, right? So Greater China Starbucks is still fully owned by Starbucks US. So have you considered that kind of like matrix? The second question is about the digital economies.
Yes.
There's one tycoon from Russia called Ozone. There's a e-commerce company who might be able to beat Amazon and also Alibaba. They are visiting Hong Kong tomorrow. So their town hall meeting is like 10,000 people in Shenzhen, like next week in here. So they have Turkey, they have Kazakhstan, and they have China market. They don't have any market. They are the most lucrative e-commerce company alive. They are listed.
Right.
And seems they're not really related to Russia government. They do related to Russian wealthy oligarchy or monarchy. So that part, we are missing the Russian part. So have you considered the past 10 years, the digital enablement and the digital economies actually disrupt your trend? And
Sure.
particularly for ADB, because you mentioned World Bank already, so there's a division for ADB called ADB Venture, who actually run by a Shanghainese senior friend who based in Manila from Shanghai. So they already started looking on the digital. So how would you feel like World Bank catching up the Asia Development Bank?
Okay,
Yeah.
right. Well, I don't really want to speak for the World Bank because I left that organization a long, long time ago. But very quickly on the digital, in the context of the book, we do obviously consider it. I mean, clearly, not least of all because some of the Chinese companies have made enormous inroads in this area and innovations indeed. And we look at the way in which, predictably Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, and the others have developed. The degree to which they have relied on state support and contracts and the like, the degree to which they are sort of entrepreneurial companies, and ultimately looking forward, the degree to which the types of factors that have made them so successful are likely to persist. And those factors are actually quite mixed. They include a lot of support, protection from competition abroad, yeah, but acute competition amongst themselves nevertheless. So you can have that. But the entrepreneurial aspect, it remains to be seen whether that will survive the political context. And in the book we argue, and this may not be an argument that necessarily gets well received in some parts of this world, that invention, which is a key feature of innovation, tends to do better when you have a great deal of liberty. Inventive people like to have the freedom to experiment and the freedom to make mistakes, the freedom to do things that push boundaries. And that, I think, for a while probably was true in China. And the question is whether it will remain true going forward. And to the extent that it doesn't, I think that will ultimately show up. By the way, there's a very interesting paper by a colleague of ours called Noam Yuchtman and a couple of others on AI in China. It appeared last year in the American Economic Review. Have you seen it? Yeah. I don't know what you think of it. I thought it was fascinating. It basically shows there's a lot of stuff going into AI, quite interesting, but there's also a lot of stuff that is going into particular forms of AI driven by the public sector's demand for those. And that includes facial recognition and the like. So these are ambiguities that exist. By the way, I think the World Bank, the IFC, tries to do venture as well, but I doubt it does it very successfully. It's too bureaucratic. But yeah. And on your first point, that's sort of slightly technical. Is McDonald's or Starbucks a Chinese or I think most of these companies, most of these multinationals, basically hedge this by setting up subsidiaries. Yeah. So if problems go awry, they can basically say the problem's in the subsidiary or not. By the way, I mean, I don't want to bang on all the time about this, but Tata's has something like 139 subsidiaries. When I used to work on Russia, the Russian companies had endless subsidiaries, and you immediately thought, why? Well, actually, it's mainly for tunneling, for taking out private profit. I mean, all the worst possible reasons. The case of Tata's and other companies is simply because they're doing in partnerships with other, with Starbucks or whatever in that case. So I think whether it's Chinese or American may not necessarily matter too much for the parent company if the subsidiary structure is set up right. And that's the thing. Incidentally, again, guess how many subsidiaries Adani has? This is after less than 20 years of operation. Just about the same as Tata's. And if I had to argue why, it wouldn't be because they were all joint ventures and other things. It would be more, I suspect, because they're sort of Russian-like in their utilization.
Can we take one more question?
Sure.
Yeah, one last one. Keep it brief.
Thank you so much, Dr. Commander, for your very informative presentation. I think it provides a good kind of summarized synopsis for the book, so I'm very looking forward to reading it. My question is slightly focused on a kind of local context in Hong Kong. Like, as I didn't see your sort of a chart on Hong Kong's kind of scenario, but I assume that it will be kind of similar situations where the top 5, 10 companies will comprises of a huge GDP here. As we always say, Hong Kong is kind of a family business. I work for traditional family business as well. What you see the future of Hong Kong in kind of this current regime? And also when you propose all the policy options, tax, competitions, I would say if I tell my big family boss about this, they will be very alert. They will be very worried about tax and competitions and how you kind of address their concerns.
Yes.
Thank you.
Gosh, William, that's a really difficult question, and I don't know that I can answer it properly because I don't think I know enough about Hong Kong. But having said that, I mean, in a way, your question touches on what I presume, in a sense, how much autonomy Hong Kong will continue to retain relative to the mainland, and hence is actually a highly political question to which I have no particularly informed answers, and I don't bring strong priors to bear on that. My guess is that probably, at least in the financial and economic realms, Hong Kong will continue to have a good deal of autonomy. It probably makes a great deal of sense for it to retain that. But I imagine that there will be very little pressure, if any, to relax the control of incumbent groups unless those incumbent groups are seen as sources of political opposition or political tension. And I would imagine, as the recent travails of HSBC show very well, that they will bend over backwards to make sure that they are not sources of political opposition. In which case, I think probably the group that you work for and others can feel fairly reassured that they will not be messed around with. I mean, but this goes back to the bigger point that we make in the book. I mean, there's no doubt that the China model of innovation and growth is hinged with very different institutional arrangements about having having scale, yeah, concentration. This is the lesson, in inverted commas, learned from South Korea. That's the model that, not the South Korean model as per se, but scale is important. And in that, if the management and ownership of those groups is susceptible to suasion or influence, well, they're not going to disturb that equilibrium, I think. But I shouldn't be saying this because I know far less than you guys, so you should be telling me.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Simon, for the deep and insightful sharing about big business groups in Asia. Related to the last conversation you two had, we're going to have a speaker coming in 2 weeks from Singapore to talk about the Singaporean experience, how they tax the rich and help the poor. Extremely sensitive to talk about that in Hong Kong, and I'm already worried about how many of my rich friends I'm going to piss off. Thank you again, Simon, and we look forward to having you coming to Hong Kong more often.
I'd love to. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks.